everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of the Light After Trauma podcast. I'm your host, Alyssa Scolari, and this episode is a super special one for me because it's the first episode in which we have another trauma warrior on air with us. She's taken a lot of the dark times in her life and she has found light in them. So today I'm going to be speaking with Valerie Ashley, who has been working with trauma survivors of all types for over 20 years. Valerie has her master's degree in community and trauma counseling from Thomas Jefferson University. She also has certifications in domestic violence and sexual abuse. And of particular interest to Valerie is how trauma affects us in the workplace. And this is something that really doesn't get a lot of light shed on it, but it's so important when it comes to being a trauma survivor and trying to figure out how to manage the workplace. I mean, our careers take up, I'd say, the majority of our lives at some points. So Valerie is coming on the show today to talk to us a little bit more about that and how we can manage being trauma survivors in the workplace. And with that being said, I am going to turn it over to Valerie. So, hello, how are you?
I'm great. How are you today, Alyssa?
I am good, thank you. Do you want to just tell the listeners like a little bit more about yourself, expand on what I said a little bit?
Sure. So, as you said, I've been practicing for more than 20 years with a specialty in what I call trauma-informed career development counseling. So that's a big title, but what I mean by that is that I have, over the years that I've worked, realized that people's trauma affects their ability to create a sustainable, healthy work life. And so I really worked on kind of paring that down to where it begins, and then helping people to make the connections between their trauma. So where their trauma begins and where their difficulties are then in their work life, and piecing those together to be able to get through even just the idea that they have any kind of professional identity. Then how do you go through a job search? Because job searches are particularly triggering for people. And then how do you get into a workplace and handle all of the workplace dynamics, like things like office politics, which requires someone to be able to really grasp the subtleties of human interaction. And when you are a trauma survivor, oftentimes those are things that you don't really learn, or you're actually, I would say, even your brain and your nervous system can't really take in. So that's the gist of what I do. I work with people individually. Right now I'm working virtually, completely virtually, but when all of this is over, we'll see. But yeah. I used to work in person. And I think that, if anybody is saying to themselves, what's wrong with me? Why can't I have a job that I can live off of and take care of my family with, or take care of myself with, or from? I think that this is the kind of thing that might help them make sense of that.
Absolutely. And I think that, as trauma survivors, the majority of us require treatment, but treatment costs money. And
Right.
to have money, we need to be able to hold down a job. And
Right.
to hold down a job, we have to be able to manage our trauma. So it's like this vicious cycle.
It is.
Right. And it's, so many bosses, I've had supervisors and bosses in the past that have said, leave your trauma at the door. Or not leave your trauma at the door per se, but leave your issues at the door when you come into work.
Right.
But when you are a survivor of developmental trauma, trauma in your childhood, your brain literally has not formed to be able to leave your baggage, quote unquote, at the door.
Right. So I completely agree with you about this idea of leave your trauma. I would say even leave your feelings at the door. Don't bring in any of who you are fundamentally as a person. I just have never in my entire adult life understood that, because who we are doesn't like stop when we go into work. And what I want to say about that too is that the other thing I find really interesting is why it is that there's so many competent, wonderful trauma therapists out there who help people integrate themselves by processing their trauma, but they end treatment right before or right when they hit work life. And I think that's like this huge piece that's kind of missing for people in trauma treatment. Um, so I think like that's one of the questions that I have is why are we not talking about how trauma impacts someone's work life? Um, and I think also the other thing I want to say about leaving your feelings at the door is that when you are a trauma survivor, one of the things, like it's kind of a weird way to say this, but you actually, there's a kind of a gift that comes out of it. And that is having an incredible sixth sense about people. Um, you learn to have a sixth sense because it's part of survival. In our world, they call that being hypervigilant. But in this case, to me, hypervigilance can be something that can really benefit you when you're going through an interview process or when you're learning to work with people because you've gotten a job. So leaving your feelings at the door is the worst thing I think a person could do, especially someone who's been exposed to trauma and has that kind of experience.
Absolutely. It's almost like, in therapy, as therapists, we work on what's called integration.
Right.
And how can anybody be expected? It's like you have to integrate as a trauma survivor, but then you go into the workplace and forget about it all. You're a robot, not a
Right.
human. Doesn't work like that. It
Right.
actually encourages dissociation.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that for complete integration through trauma processing, this piece of work has to be done. And I still question why no one's really looking at how to do that. So maybe and also dissociation is definitely something that is encouraged by that idea that you're just going to leave everything at the door. You need to bring all those feelings in so you can manage how you're feeling, and not actually dissociate either in an interview or when you're actually working, because things will trigger you on the job. So maybe that's something we could just talk about a little bit. Maybe what we could do is start by just talking about why the job search for most trauma survivors is so triggering. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
that is one of the things I wanted to ask is like more specifically and more concretely, what are some of the issues that you have
Right.
found that come up for people?
Right. So like I said earlier, I've kind of taken my thought process back to the very beginning. So the very beginning is first understanding what someone's trauma is. And most people who come to me have done some of that work, but not all of them. So if there's still more that needs to be done around processing their trauma, that's something that we can do. But then what we really need to look at at that point is, who are you? What are you looking for? Do you even have a notion about what kind of work you want to do or how you see yourself fitting into professional life? And I would argue that a lot of trauma survivors do not have that, because that process takes place when you're young, generally speaking. So a child, my idea is that a child, as they develop, they get access or they get exposed to jobs and professions through their parents' friends, through their clergy, through their community, their teachers, their neighbors. And if you absorb that, you absorb, like, you might see a fireman on a fire truck and say, hey, what is that guy doing? Or that truck's really cool, I want to drive that. And maybe your parents take you to visit a firehouse. And so you get some exposure. And let's say you meet a teacher that is you particularly gel with, and you think, wow, I would like to be her. So these are sort of the ways that children begin to develop their ideas about who they are or who they want to be. And as you grow older, and I would say you get into high school, those what I call vague notions about the things that are of interest to you probably have been, pared down a bit. And maybe what you find out from your schooling is that you're particularly drawn to art classes, let's say, and you're really talented in that arena. And so you are either going to come out with an idea, vague notion about a focus for a job search, or you're going to come out with an idea or focus for a concentration in college. It depends on what direction you're going in. And that's sort of where you grow from then and develop a work life. What I say is that when you are living in a traumatized situation, you're in a home where there's chaos, where there's abuse, you live in a neighborhood, where there's crime, or you go to school and you work with teachers who they themselves are trauma survivors, the chances of you being able to develop that are very little, because your nervous system is so heightened and so on alert all the time that that's what you're focused on. So what my work does is it actually allows people to go back and recreate that process so that they're able to kind of start to say, oh yeah, I remember being interested in this, or, I've always really admired people who did that. And then once you have that, then you can start to actually create a focus again, either for going to school or for a job search. So let me just stop there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So basically, what I hear you saying is one of the main goals of your work is to sort of help people to break down their trauma defenses so that they can see who they really are and what path they really want to take in life.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to say it, breaking down their trauma defenses. Or I would also say, maybe we're saying the same kind of thing, but also just connect, their reactivity, let's say, to something that they have to do in order to get a job. So I want to just say a little bit about that. So let's just think about asking a trauma survivor to write their resume. And this happened to me. This is kind of how I started to figure this out. And the client wouldn't do it. And I didn't understand why they wouldn't do it. And at first, my reaction was, oh, they're, being obstinate, not just resistant, but obstinate. And then I realized that the reason that they didn't want to do it was because writing a resume requires you to look at your history and to think about your history. And that's probably one of the last things that trauma survivors want to do. So you can see how what you're talking about breaking down your trauma barriers is involved right here in actually doing a job search. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's honestly mind-blowing to me because it's one of those things that you would think would be so simple, but you're right. Asking somebody to write a resume is asking somebody to reflect back on their history. And I would imagine that the same difficulties arise even in an interview
Right.
process. So let's say trauma survivors land an interview. How do you think that that interview process affects
Right. Well,
people?
let me just first, before I go on to that, and I will just say, with respect to the resume, not only are you asked to reflect on your history, but you're also asked to say what you're good at doing and say, and most people who have this kind of trauma exposure or any kind of trauma exposure really don't know what they're good at doing. So that becomes another trigger, like, oh God, I don't know what I'm good at doing. So how am I supposed to write this? So, but your other question regarding interviewing is really critical because let's just think about when we go into an interview and someone says, so, Alyssa, tell me about yourself. I can almost guarantee you that a trauma survivor, without this kind of intervention from trauma-informed career development counseling, is going to just have like their brain explode because they don't know what to say. The first thing they might think of is, well, I'm a trauma survivor, because there is that in their identity, but they know you can't say that in an interview. So that's where dissociation can occur. And I've seen, clients, I've known of them, they go in, they dissociate, and they cannot remember anything about what they're trying to say. And I would argue that a lot of people who have that dissociation happen to them should consider, is their trauma affecting them in that particular way? And then the second question that you might be asked is, so why should I hire you over somebody with the same credentials? And
even just listening to that gives me
right.
butterflies in my stomach. I can't even
And so,
imagine.
think about it. Like, if your whole life you've kind of felt as if you're less than, you're worthless, you don't amount to anything, you don't get things right, you're filled with shame. Asking you that question again is mind-blowing. And so what the trauma-informed career development counseling does is it helps someone to recognize that connection and then to learn how to talk about themselves. So now you have a resume that really, for people, when they see a resume, and what I usually do is write it for them so that they can see themselves in black and white, and they can use that resume then as a guideline for how they want to talk about themselves. So there's a lot of processing that goes on there in order for someone to be able to be even successful in an interview.
Wow. So let me ask you this. What advice would you give somebody? So let's say some of our listeners out there are struggling. They have a therapist and they have this sort of rift or separation wherein they go to work and then they go to therapy, but they're triggered in work, but they never really bring that into the therapy session. What advice might you give somebody who's struggling with that? Because I think that as trauma survivors, we've all, even once we get to the point where we do become employed and we do get a job, I mean, I know personally, I can recall countless times being so triggered by people who I worked with, people in authoritative positions, and I wouldn't understand why, but I didn't even know enough to be able to bring it to my therapist and talk to her about it. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's a really good question. So what I would advise someone to do is to work with someone who is familiar with how trauma affects you on the job. I'm a therapist, so I would work with somebody to understand relationally what's happening between them and another person. But I'm also going to be able to look at, so what's happening here between you and this person in relationship to your trauma. So an example is, I have found over the years of doing this work an uncanny, granted anecdotal, connection between trauma survivors and picking abusive bosses, or picking up
Yes.
bosses that, I've had them where you're like, what is
Yes.
happening here?
Yes. Yes.
I can't, this person doesn't treat me well. I don't understand what their directions are. They're making me feel like scattered and chaotic. And I don't know why. And I think the tendency is for us to blame ourselves. That's the first thing, to say that there's something wrong with us, when in fact, there may well be something that, maybe you're working for a boss who's just abusive, who's had their own trauma. And with 70% of Americans experiencing at least one trauma, you're bound to be running into people who you're working for who've had trauma. So what I'm going to go back then further and say, the thing to do is to look at, in my opinion, the thing to do is to look at how you came to have that job with that person. What are the kind of questions that you asked? What were you feeling when you were in the interview? Because as I said earlier, this sixth sense that I think trauma survivors have in this situation is a real gift, because it allows us to pick up on those feelings. But if we're not paying attention to the feelings, then we won't pick up on it. So I just think that it's really important to make sure that the interview process is one where you're very tuned in. And if you are in a situation like that with a boss that is making you crazy, or a work situation that's making you crazy, pay attention to it and know that you can change your job, that you're not stuck, that this isn't the only place that you can work, which I think is another kind of symptom, if you will, of having lived with trauma, is this
Yeah, you
feeling
feel
like
like
you're
you're
helpless.
trapped.
Right. You're trapped and you're helpless, and you're not. I mean, so there's sort of this very circular thing that goes on with people who have trauma, from the beginning stages to being on the job to being in a situation where maybe you have to change your job. So knowing how to go through a job search without all the triggers is part of what opens you up to new opportunities.
Yeah. And part of, like, I love the way you put it, and it makes me smile actually when I hear you say it, when you talk about us having a sixth sense and embracing it. I just think that I've never heard it put that way before, and I think that it's such an empowering way to put it. It makes us feel empowered, like having a sixth sense. It's so true.
Right. And it is empowering. And I think, there's so much that trauma survivors go through when to heal and to become integrated. And this is one of those pieces of the trauma experience that is a strength. And I'm all about, like, what are your strengths? What do you know how to do? Let's give voice to that part of you that sort of has been squashed. And the sixth sense is something that I see repeatedly over and over and over again. And that's why I'm so confident sort of saying it. So it's a real strength, I think.
Yeah, it is. And I love hearing you put it that way. I just think that this topic is so important and it's not given nearly enough attention. And I'm wondering, how did you come to develop such a passion for this specific area?
Well, that's a great question. I have, for my entire work life, been in career development in one form or fashion. And actually, I sort of fell into it, like a lot of people do. Uh, I come from a family of therapists, and at the time, I did not want to be a therapist. I was not interested. But I was really interested and good with people. And I was really interested in that intersection between psychology and business, psychology and work life. I just think I studied psychology, and I kind of started to think about that a lot. And so I had a job, and my job was as a manager, director of a career development center. And part of my job was to interview the students. I call them kids, but I think I was actually pretty close to the same age. But at any rate, so I started to realize that in those interviews that some people had personal histories that affected them. So the trigger for this whole thing was talking to a student who was interested in the law, had really good grades in the graduate program I worked in, but his grades from his university, which was a really good university, were not on par with what he needed to have litigation firms really look at him. And something just didn't add up. So I asked him this question, which I now ask all the time. What's the most difficult thing you've ever had to deal with in your life to date? And he said to me, when my mother died suddenly during my junior year of college, and a light bulb went on, and I thought, oh, okay, that's what happened. No wonder his grades plummeted. But it gave me the tools then to be able to say to him, so this is how you have to talk about this when you go into a litigation firm, or write about it, or in a cover letter, or at any rate, bring it up, because it'll make the picture make sense. And that's from there, I just sort of took off. And I said, part of what we're doing is we're not asking people the right questions. It's interesting in career development, career counseling, vocational psychology, whatever term you want to use for it. One of the things that really happened about 100 years ago is that who you are as a person and what you do for your work started to be separated out. So therapists did one piece of the work and career counselors did another. And then it sort of started to come back together a bit, but it's still, in my opinion, if you look at all the theories over the past 100 years, they're amazing theories, but one thing they don't include is any discussion of trauma history. And as soon as you add trauma history into career development, all of those theories have gaps. So, when this student said this to me, I just thought, these are the kind of questions that we need to be asking as career development specialists, but also we need to be willing to integrate, to think about a whole person and not just work they do, because what work they do is completely affected by, or don't do, is completely affected by their emotional life and their personal history. So that's kind of how this launched.
Absolutely. It's so true. It's so true. And I think back to being in graduate school and having my career counseling class. And I remember that class very, very specifically because it was late at night and my teacher was so boring. I apologize if you're listening out there, but it was a terrible class. And we never once talked about trauma and how that impacts the work environment
Right.
and your career development. Never once was it brought up.
Right.
And looking back on it, it's kind of like, oh, like, duh, like what, why weren't we thinking? Like, why did we do
Yeah, I
this?
don't know. I don't know. And I was in a graduate program that was strictly trauma. Every class was about trauma, but in a different, trauma of the family, trauma, the neurobiology of trauma. And the career development class, I can't say it was void of that topic because it was a trauma program, a graduate program, but there wasn't a lot to go on to talk about it. So, my understanding of the career development class is that it's really structured around passing the LPC or the exams, because there's a lot of information on those board exams, licensing exams that you have
Yes.
to know in order to
Yes.
do it. But it's like, I just think about it and I think, gosh, we're just missing an entire piece of a person's life. And actually, rather a large piece of their life. If you think about how many hours a day we spend working and then how many years we work, that's a lot of the person's life. So I'm
Absolutely.
kind of on a mission to get the word out about this, because this is something that we need to be talking about and we need to be creating curriculum around and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is that, so your master's degree is specifically in trauma. And I know you said earlier you come from a family full of
Right.
therapists and you had no interest in being a
No.
therapist. How how did you get on this path of having a passion for trauma?
Right. That's a great question. So, like a lot of other therapists, and especially people who study trauma, I had my own. I grew up in a family where my parents were both foreigners. My mother was French, and she grew up in Paris during the Nazi occupation. and she and her family, most of her family survived. But, you know, the way I describe it is it's like it's growing up in a family with a depression of the soul. And when somebody goes through what my mother went through, it's trauma on so many different levels. And I think it sort of, I mean, I'm a big believer in it seeping into you through your DNA. And I never really understood because my mother would not talk about what her experience was. And we weren't raised as Jews. So I was never around anybody who had that experience. I think I told you I was actually raised as a Quaker, which I think is really, really ironic given the silence, the way that Quakers worship is in silence. And there was silence all around the issues that my mom grew up with. And then my father was British and he grew up during the war in London and suffered terribly, a lot of trauma there. So there was that in my family. And you know, so I kind of grew up that way. And then I myself was in a really bad accident when I was 19. And I think that actually started me on a path of trying to understand. I mean, it was sort of trauma on trauma. And maybe if, you know, my siblings didn't have that and maybe they were able to navigate the trauma in a different way, but I couldn't. It was such a bad accident that it forced me to go into therapy. And I still didn't want to be a therapist, but I was always just geared in that way because my mother's a therapist, my sister's a therapist, you know, my brother-in-law was a psychiatrist. It was just around me and it just was normal to me that people went into therapy, and that therapy was beneficial. But I think that so I spent a lot of time in career development, but being a therapist per se, really, like I made that decision a few years ago when I was in Paris with my son, and I visited the grave of my ancestors who are buried in a very prominent Catholic cemetery, Père Lachaise in Paris. And they were Jews, and I could see that they were all Jews because of their names and because of the Jewish star and because there was Hebrew written on their gravestone. And it really struck me. And I think because I grew up in America, I really didn't have access to that. And it just struck me. I was like, oh my God, I'm the great great granddaughter and granddaughter and great granddaughter and niece, you know, to all of these people who were survivors, either of the Holocaust or the First World War. You know, it just was so clear to me. It was something that I had to do, that I needed to expand and really help people process their trauma because I feel incredibly fortunate that I've been able to do that. And it's a hard process and it's not fun for people to do at all. But I think that it's life-saving. And I think that you can overcome your trauma. And there are people out there who can help you to do it, and you can overcome it in every aspect of your life.
Absolutely. People can recover. And I think recovery looks different for everybody. And I personally believe recovery is a lifelong process.
I do
But,
too. Yeah.
right. And I don't think you're always suffering. And I think a lot of trauma survivors are suffering, but there
Absolutely.
is absolutely hope. And you can absolutely get to this point where you move from being in the suffering to owning your pain and integrating, like we've talked about. And again, that process looks different for everybody. What would you say is one of the biggest contributing factors to your personal healing?
I just wanted to go back and just add on to something that you were just saying, and that is not only can you live in joy, but the fact that you've survived this trauma, whatever the trauma is, makes you an incredibly unique, interesting, powerful person. Because I feel like I found a voice, my voice in all of this. And so I just wanted to say that I don't think this being a trauma survivor is, there are some things about it that make you who you are, and it's very unlike other people.
Yep.
And I value that a lot. I no longer look back and say, geez, I wish I had other parents. I'm so grateful for the parents I had. I'm so grateful for what they taught me. I don't know. The way that they educated me. So just let me come back to your question, though. I think one of the biggest was working with a therapist who did EMDR. And yeah, and I started to do that. I was triggered by something. It doesn't even make sense, right? It doesn't make sense what it was. It's kind of irrelevant, but it was right around my birthday. And my mom, who was alive then, she said to me, "This is the trauma from your accident. See, this is what it's like to have a parent who's a therapist." And I was like, "What?" And she said, "I'm telling you, this is the trauma from your accident, and something triggered you, and you need to go see someone who does this." So my mother did EMDR on everything having to do with her own trauma. And it was a miracle how much it changed my mom, because before that, and I love my mother dearly, and I'm really glad she was my mom. But before that, it was a struggle for her when there were four of us and I'm the youngest, but it was hard for her for us to be needy, because I think she was so needy herself. At any rate, she was this very brave woman who constantly reinvented herself. And so at around age 70, she started to see this EMDR therapist. And she became the mom that I always wanted. And the reason that she was like that is because she could share herself in a way that she never did before. She really grew peaceful in her own self, and she was more available because of that to me. And so when she said that to me, I was like, okay. I mean, I honestly, and even to this day, I still don't really understand, but I started that work with an EMDR professional named Michael D'Antonio, who's in the Philadelphia area, who I remember after starting it that my husband said to me, "Oh, this is the new improved Valerie." Like it was very subtle, but it was like I had so much anger that it sort of came out sideways sometimes, and that just dissipated. It actually kind of went away. And I remember my sister saying to me, "Well, it feels like the Valerie that we knew when you were younger before this accident has returned." And that's sort of what I felt like, energetic and not angry and able to think. And it was just been an amazing process. And I highly recommend that for anybody. Like, I felt like I'd said all I could say. I didn't know what else to say anymore. And EMDR kind of helped me to look at how it was connected to my body, not and my brain, but not just through talking and thoughts,
Right.
if you will. So that to me has been the most healing work I've done. And, I would say one other thing is having children. And it was very healing to have children and to be able to raise them in the manner I had wanted to be raised. And again, that's not to put down my parents, because I love them dearly, but I can see ways in which this, I felt like, okay, I'm picking up this mantle and moving it into this generation, and I can do better. I should do better. I'm called on to do better as a parent. And I think being responsible that way for as soon as you have children, you have to start thinking about how you're affecting them. And I wanted to be really careful and sure that I wasn't affecting them in a deleterious way. So yeah,
Absolutely, because you realize that trauma can be passed down through the
absolutely.
generations.
And
So,
yeah, and my kids knew my mom. My mother just died actually this time last year, but I think, my kids knew her, and but we weren't silent about everything. We talked about it. And
right.
so it was out in the open. And so anyway, that's the other thing that I think really helped me.
That's incredible. That's incredible. The work that you do is incredible. Your journey to this career for you is incredible. Right now, what does the work that you're doing right now consist of?
I work as a trauma therapist, and I do have this specialty, and I really want to, I'm willing to work with people who have trauma, period. Um, I'm especially interested in working with people who are recognizing that their trauma is affecting them in their work life, or maybe just not even realizing that, but having trouble with their work life. I also wanted to go back to something we talked about at the very beginning, which is I recognize that there's a whole circular problem with being a trauma survivor, under earning, being underemployed, not having the money to see a therapist, and so on and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I'm doing right now, especially because of the horrible trauma that's happened to people because of COVID, losing their jobs unceremoniously, having not knowing what to do now. And that's something that I think is actually like another conversation, but not knowing what to do and being really frightened. And if you're already a trauma survivor, this is especially triggering. So at any rate, what I was going to say is that have a sliding scale for people who are have a financial need, and I'm really willing to discuss that with people. And I do work individually, and I also work, as I said earlier, over virtually right now, because I don't think it's safe to be in an office
Right.
together. So does that answer your question?
Absolutely. So if people are interested in learning more about you and the awesome things that you are doing, they can head over to your website, which is
Right.
ValerieAshley.Counseling.com, right?
Right. And yep. And there's a contact page there, but you can also read about, what I do, and read more about it, and read about my credentialing. I wanted to add one other thing. I'm also really open to training. So I've done trainings for therapists, especially therapists who works with domestic violence survivors, because that's another conversation too. There's a whole host of issues around work life for domestic violence survivors, but I'm really interested in training other therapists on how to use this work, or how to recognize it when it's coming up with your clients. So that's another avenue that people might want to use me for.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I will make sure that Valerie's website will be listed on the show notes when this episode airs. So you guys can just check out the show notes and go look at her website and learn more about her. And I think that's it. I'm so happy you were
Yeah.
able to come on today. I feel like we
Me
could
too.
have a million conversations about a
Right.
million different topics, but
We could.
I really, really appreciate you coming on
Yeah.
today.
My pleasure, really. It's been wonderful to talk with you. And you're a great trauma therapist, and I love the way you
Oh,
think about things.
thank you.
Yes, so thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening, everyone. For more information about today's episode and to sign up for the Light After Trauma newsletter, head over to my website at AlyssaScolari.com. The really great thing about being a part of this newsletter is that not only do you get weekly updates on new podcast episodes and blog posts, but you also get access to the private Facebook community, as well as access to all sorts of insider tips, resources, and infographics that supplement what we talk about on the show. You also can connect with me and other trauma warriors. I'm super active on the Facebook community, and I look forward to talking with you.